There was one moment during the Second World War when the future of the entire world rested on a decision so dangerous that even some of Winston Churchill's closest allies believed it bordered on madness. If it had failed, Britain might have surrendered, Nazi Germany could have dominated Europe for decades, and the history you know today would have been completely different. Yet, when people talk about Churchill, they almost always remember the speeches, the cigars, and the famous promise to fight on the beaches. Almost nobody talks about the gamble that made those speeches matter in the first place. It was a gamble built on uncertainty, hope, and the belief that one nation could survive long enough for history itself to change. By the end of this story, you'll understand why some historians consider it one of the boldest strategic decisions ever made, while others argue it came dangerously close to ending Britain's fight before victory was even possible. Before we uncover what really happened, imagine standing where Churchill stood. Your army has suffered devastating defeats, your allies have collapsed one after another, and the strongest military machine in Europe is preparing to turn its full attention toward your tiny island. Would you risk everything on a plan that had no guarantee of success? Or would you choose peace to save your people? As you listen, think carefully about what you would have done, because the answer isn't nearly as simple as it seems. By the spring of 1940, Europe was falling apart at breathtaking speed. Nazi Germany had already stunned the world by conquering country after country with terrifying efficiency. Poland had fallen. Denmark had collapsed almost overnight. Norway was lost despite Allied efforts. Belgium surrendered. The Netherlands was overwhelmed. Then came the unthinkable. France, one of Europe's greatest military powers, crumbled in only a matter of weeks. For generations, people believed France possessed one of the strongest armies on earth. Yet Germany shattered that belief with shocking speed. Across Britain, fear spread through cities, villages, factories, and homes. Newspapers carried grim headlines almost every day. Families wondered whether German troops would soon be landing on British beaches. Military planners rushed to prepare defenses while ordinary citizens dug air raid shelters and waited anxiously for what seemed inevitable. The feeling was impossible to ignore. Britain suddenly stood almost completely alone against Adolf Hitler. When Winston Churchill became Prime Minister in May 1940, he didn't inherit a confident nation ready for victory. He inherited panic. His predecessor, Neville Chamberlain, had resigned after losing the confidence of Parliament following disastrous military setbacks. Churchill stepped into office at perhaps the darkest moment in modern British history. Every report arriving on his desk seemed worse than the one before it. Military commanders warned of shortages in equipment. Supplies were stretched dangerously thin. The Royal Air Force was preparing for what many believed would be an overwhelming assault. The British Army had escaped disaster at Dunkirk, but much of its heavy equipment had been abandoned on the beaches of France. Thousands of vehicles, tanks, artillery pieces, and weapons were gone. Britain had saved many of its soldiers, but it had lost much of the equipment needed to continue fighting. To outside observers, the situation looked hopeless. Inside Churchill's own government, another battle was quietly unfolding. While millions feared a German invasion, several influential political leaders believed continuing the war was simply too dangerous. They argued that Britain should explore negotiations with Hitler before everything was lost. Some believed that Italy, which had not yet fully committed itself to Germany's side, could act as a mediator between Britain and Nazi Germany. Their reasoning sounded practical. If Britain negotiated now, perhaps it could preserve its independence, avoid devastating destruction, and prevent countless civilian deaths. It wasn't cowardice that motivated many of these officials. It was fear mixed with realism. Looking at maps, military reports, and the collapse of nearly every Allied nation, peace seemed like the only logical option. To many experienced politicians, Churchill's determination to continue fighting looked less like courage and more like dangerous stubbornness. Churchill listened carefully to every argument. He understood the terrifying reality facing Britain better than almost anyone else. He knew his country's military weaknesses. He knew the Royal Navy could not be everywhere at once. He knew German bombers would soon target British cities. He knew an invasion remained a real possibility. Yet despite all these dangers, Something deep inside him refused to believe that surrender or negotiation would bring lasting peace. Churchill believed that any agreement with Hitler would only delay Britain's destruction rather than prevent it. He saw Nazi Germany not as a government seeking compromise, but as a regime driven by expansion, domination, and absolute control. If Britain surrendered its freedom today, what would stop Hitler from demanding even more tomorrow? Churchill concluded that accepting temporary safety might guarantee permanent defeat. That belief became the foundation of the greatest gamble of his career. Churchill wasn't betting because he possessed overwhelming military strength. In fact, Britain was frighteningly weak compared to Germany's war machine. He wasn't betting because victory appeared likely. Almost every military assessment suggested the opposite. Instead, Churchill gambled on something far more uncertain. He believed history was still moving. He believed circumstances could change. He believed Germany would eventually make mistakes. He believed Britain's geographical position offered advantages that no conquered nation on mainland Europe possessed. Most importantly, he believed that if Britain could simply survive long enough, new allies might eventually join the fight. It wasn't confidence based on guarantees. It was confidence built on possibilities. And sometimes, possibilities are enough to shape history. At first glance, that strategy sounded almost unbelievable. Imagine leading an entire nation while telling millions of frightened citizens that survival depended not on immediate victory but on simply holding on. Britain couldn't afford to lose hope because hope itself had become part of its military strategy. Every factory that continued producing aircraft mattered. Every sailor protecting supply convoys mattered. Every pilot defending British skies mattered. Every civilian refusing to panic mattered. Churchill understood that wars were fought not only with weapons but also with determination. If Britain lost its will to resist, then Germany wouldn't even need to invade. Victory would arrive through surrender alone. Churchill recognized that morale could become just as important as guns, tanks, or aircraft. As debates continued behind closed doors, Churchill faced another problem that the public barely understood. Time was running out. German forces controlled enormous parts of Europe. Their factories produced vast quantities of military equipment. Their armies had gained confidence after repeated victories. Britain, meanwhile, relied heavily on supplies arriving across the Atlantic Ocean. Food, fuel, ammunition, raw materials, and countless essential goods traveled by sea. If those supply routes were cut, Britain would struggle to continue fighting regardless of how determined its people remained. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships with increasing success. Every convoy represented a race between survival and disaster. Churchill knew Britain's fate wasn't decided only on battlefields. It was also being decided beneath the waves. At the same time, Churchill quietly placed enormous faith in another possibility that few people fully appreciated. Across the Atlantic sat the United States, officially neutral and deeply divided about entering another European war. Many Americans wanted nothing to do with another overseas conflict after the horrors of the First World War. President Franklin Roosevelt sympathized with Britain, but political realities limited how far he could go without public support. Churchill understood this better than anyone. Yet he believed that if Britain refused to surrender, eventually America would recognize that Nazi Germany threatened not just Europe but the future balance of the entire world. It was an extraordinary assumption because no one could predict if or when the United States would abandon neutrality. Churchill wasn't simply gambling on Britain's strength. He was gambling on time, diplomacy, public opinion, and the unpredictable course of history itself. Looking back today, it's tempting to assume Churchill always knew everything would work out. History often creates that illusion. We know Britain survived. We know the Allies eventually won the war. We know America entered the conflict and that Germany was ultimately defeated. But Churchill knew none of that. Every morning he woke to uncertainty. Every decision carried enormous consequences. Every speech risked raising hopes that might later be crushed. Every military order could send thousands of young men into battles they might never return from. The outcome remained completely unknown. That is what made his gamble so extraordinary. He chose resistance when nearly every fact suggested defeat was more likely than victory. The world remembers the triumph. Few remember just how impossible that triumph appeared when the gamble first began. The gamble became even more extraordinary because Churchill was not relying on courage alone. Hidden behind layers of secrecy was one of the most important intelligence operations in history. In a quiet country estate called Bletchley Park, mathematicians, linguists, engineers, and puzzle experts were working around the clock to crack Germany's most sophisticated military codes. Every intercepted message carried the possibility of revealing enemy troop movements, submarine patrols, and strategic plans. At first, their successes were limited, and no one could promise that the code-breaking effort would change the war. But Churchill immediately recognized its potential. He gave the operation extraordinary support, ensuring that these brilliant minds received the resources they needed despite Britain's desperate financial situation. Years later, many historians would argue that the intelligence produced at Bletchley Park shortened the war by years. Churchill understood something few leaders appreciated. Information could become a weapon more powerful than bullets. Knowing where the enemy planned to strike often mattered more than having a larger army. It was another piece of the gamble, another investment in a future no one could yet see, and another reminder that victory often begins with knowledge long before it appears on the battlefield. Meanwhile, the skies above Britain were becoming the stage for a battle unlike anything the world had witnessed before. Adolf Hitler believed Britain would eventually surrender once its air defenses had been destroyed. The German Luftwaffe launched wave after wave of bombing raids, expecting to overwhelm the Royal Air Force through sheer force and relentless pressure. Every day, young pilots climbed into their aircraft knowing many would never return. They were often outnumbered, exhausted, and facing experienced German aviators who had already conquered much of Europe. Yet something remarkable happened. British radar stations provided early warnings, allowing fighter squadrons to intercept incoming attacks with surprising efficiency. Ground crews worked tirelessly to repair damaged aircraft overnight, sending them back into combat the next morning. Civilian volunteers supported rescue operations while factories continued producing desperately needed planes. Churchill watched the struggle unfold with growing determination. He knew that if the Royal Air Force survived, Hitler's invasion plans would become infinitely more difficult. Britain's fate depended on hundreds of ordinary young men making extraordinary decisions thousands of feet above the ground, and every successful defense bought Churchill another precious day. As bombs rained down on London and other major cities, many believed civilian morale would finally collapse. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Historic buildings burned through the night. Families spent endless hours inside underground stations, listening to explosions echo through the darkness, while wondering whether their homes would still be standing by morning. Children were evacuated from dangerous cities, separated from parents for months at a time.